They didn't know it was going to happen. We know how it came out. They didn't know. That day they had decided to go out and fight. And it wasn't the same sort of fight that you might expect now. They were under the rule of the regulars, of the British Army. They were under military rule at the time. Anybody who picked up a musket or rifle, aimed it at one of the king's troops, the redcoat, was by that act guilty of treason. And any officer of the redcoats could grab that person and string them up to the nearest tree. No trial necessary. And if they were feeling really bad, they'd burn your house down, turn your family on the road. And since people tended to live kind of close together, they might just burn down some of your relatives' houses too. There's no insurance. No life insurance, no health insurance. If your family's out on the road and you're dead, they're going to have to hope some relatives take them in. You get shot and wounded, there's no anesthetic beyond a good shot of rum. There's also no antibiotics. So in some cases you're better off if you take one right here, not have to worry about gangrene and other fun things. And there are histories of people being whittled away a piece at a time to try and maintain some amount of their livelihood. Better one leg than gone and your family on the road. That's what they were undertaking that day. It was a pretty tough choice. That's what lies at the root of that Second Amendment, is the people that were willing to take that choice. So we're all volunteers. One of the reasons we volunteer to do this is we think that story isn't told enough. And people don't think enough about the consequences of what they did and what it means to us now. So we tell that story a little bit, and I'm going to tell more now than I usually do, because we got a bunch of fog, so I get to do this. We got to be sure that you can actually see what you're shooting at. So I'll talk a little bit about where that all came from. Vamp a little bit here. So where did the British colonies, mostly it were British colonies in North America, where did that come from? Where did this attitude start? So particularly around the Bay Area, I like to say that the colonists were a combination of entrepreneurs and outcasts. So if you were part of the ruling class in Great Britain, you didn't have a lot of incentive to come over here. You remember Parliament, part of the clergy, had a title. Who wants to come over to the howling wilderness? You had to scratch a hole in the forest, raise some crops, and hope the Native Americans didn't get you. Not to speak of the disease. So one class that got sent over here were people that ended up on the wrong end of things. If you were a persecuted Puritan, you might have ended up in Massachusetts. Later on, the Puritans were in and the Royalists were out, so they ended up in Virginia. And then it went back the other way and more Puritans came over. If you were Catholic, you might have ended up in Maryland. Quakers ended up in Pennsylvania. If you were in prison for debt, you could have ended up in Georgia. That was the downside. You got here whether you liked it or not. The upside, from some points of view, was you could try for new life over here. And the way that happened makes a big difference. So if you were the second or third son of one of those nobles or a rich merchant, you wouldn't stand to inherit anything by the rules under England at the time. But if you had the right connections, you could apply to the king and his officers what they called a charter. And a charter would say two things. One is, if you can manage to settle it and hold it, you have titles of these thousands and thousands of square miles of howling wilderness. All right, you might get a chunk the size of Virginia that in fact extended as far west as you can manage to march. That's a deal, except you're not getting any money with it. It's all on you to take care of it. So how did they make that possible? Part of those charters talked about the remission of taxes and about rights that were extended to the people that came over here, that were above those that you could have if you were sort of in the lower classes in England at the time. So taxes on the lower class at that time might be as high as a third. Oh my God. That's horrible. But if you come over here, those are remitted. You only pay what is voted on here. And some things like you could be called upon if you were in the peasant class to work the Lord's fields, to go out and work on the roads or bridges with no compensation, no matter what you need to do for your holding. Those were remitted. So that in turn attracted a bunch of people that if they'd stayed behind in England would have been trapped in the lower classes. Nothing to inherit, just working on the Lord's land for the rest of your life. So those were the entrepreneurs who were willing to step off into the unknown and take a chance. And when the casualty reports started coming back from places like Jamestown and the Pilgrims, everybody knew it was a chance. So those were the two types of people that came over here. People that were willing to take a chance and be self-reliant. Well, why would the king and parliament do this? Giving away hundreds of thousands of miles of land. Because they were broke. So the king and parliament periodically got themselves in European wars. About every 20, 30 years. The 1600s, right on. They got themselves in the European war. And unlike South America, where the Spanish could just come in and loot the natives, take the gold and silver, send it back home, and you're in business. In North America, you actually had to work to make something of it. Cut down the trees and turn them into mast, to grow some crops, feed yourself, maybe raise a surplus to send them back home. It took capital investment. It took time. So, from the point of view of the king and parliament, this was a pretty good deal. We get rid of some people we don't particularly want. They're going to be troublemakers if they stick around. We get them to use their money to settle a place. Win. And in fact, it was. It led a policy of what was later on called salutary neglect. It simply means it turned out to be a good thing to leave them alone. And in fact, the colonies took off in terms of population, in terms of the importance to the economy of the empire. This went on for 7 generations. We look back at the revolution and say, that's so long ago. You know, so all those things that far back sort of blur out together. That was probably just like a few years after the settlement. No, people had been in the same place for 6 to 7 generations of their family. In the area we talked about, Massachusetts, many of them just plain stayed in the same place. They had a long history. They'd gotten used to a couple of things. First one was self-reliance. Right? King didn't send anybody over to help out. Bring enough supplies to live through the first winter, get a crop in, you better hope it works. Cut those trees down, nobody's going to help. Get ready to defend yourself. That's one thing they got used to. The other thing they got used to was self-rule. At that point, nobody was trying to tell them what to do from 3,000 miles away across an ocean. The proprietor would usually set up a governor or governing council. And if you were a settler with a certain amount of land, you had the franchise. Back in Great Britain, you had to own a certain amount of land or you couldn't vote. Well, that was a two-class society with very abundant labor, cheap wages. On this side of the water, they were scratching for more people, and wages were expensive. The land was cheap. There's hundreds of thousands of miles out there. So it was pretty easy for somebody to make the property qualification to vote. As we all know, it was adult males at the time. But unlike back in Britain, where maybe 20% would have the vote, here a majority had the vote. So everybody got used to having a say in what was going to happen. So marinate that for 6 to 7 generations in comparison to what had been left behind. And that lies kind of at the root of the story we're going to tell over lunch. Or maybe a little earlier if the bloody fog doesn't take off.